The old man entered the courtroom in shackles, his steps uneven, his coat 3 sizes too big and stained from nights spent sleeping beside alley dumpsters. "Name?" the clerk barked. He didn't look up. "Raymond Callahan. Staff Sergeant, United States Marine Corps." Somewhere in the back, someone chuckled. But he didn't flinch. Didn't defend. Didn't explain. He just stood there, weathered and silent, as if the name alone should have meant something. It didn't, until the judge opened his file, and her hand began to shake. She froze, lips parting in disbelief, as if a ghost had walked through the doors. What unfolded next silenced the entire room, brought decorated men to their feet, and ended with a military colonel handing over a wooden box that hadn't seen daylight in 20 years. Because sometimes, justice doesn't wear a robe. It wears a uniform, and never asks for anything in return. If you believe dignity doesn't fade with age or silence, keep watching. Type honor to stand with those who served, and follow this story if your heart still answers when duty calls. Raymond Callahan was 68 years old, though most would guess older by the way time had pressed itself into the hollows of his cheeks and the heavy set of his shoulders. His beard, gray and uneven, clung to a weathered face marked by years of sun, smoke, and silence. He wore a surplus Marine Corps jacket far too big for his frame, the fabric fraying at the cuffs, its camouflage faded to a murky green-gray that no longer belonged to any branch of the military. But he never looked broken, just quiet. Not bowed, but withdrawn, like a man who had chosen stillness over explanation. Ray spoke little, but every morning, rain, frost, or heat, he returned to the same spot, behind Jefferson Street, cafe. He'd sit near the exhaust vent, cupping his hands around a warm paper cup, even if it held nothing. Always arrived at 6:15. Always folded the foil from last night's leftovers, with the care of a man who once packed battlefield supplies. He lived alone, drifting from shelter to shelter, sometimes sleeping behind the bus depot, sometimes beneath the bridge near 4th and Maple. Most people walked past him. Some looked away. Some looked through. But Jimmy, the cafe's cook, never forgot. His dad served in Desert Storm. He knew the silence that service leaves behind. Ray had served 21 years in the Marine Corps. Vietnam. Desert Shield. Iraq. The medals meant less to him than the names of the men he couldn't bring back. The VA files lost his name. The world lost his face. And one bitter December morning, when the steam stopped early and his joints refused to bend, an officer stepped out back and said, "You can't stay here." Ray didn't flinch. He didn't protest. He just said, 5 more minutes. The officer didn't wait for an answer. By the time Ray pushed himself to his feet, stiff joints aching from cold and age, the handcuffs were already out. The metal clicked tight behind his back, and for a moment he winced, but not from pain. From familiarity. It had been decades since he last wore restraint, and back then it was during training exercises. Now there was no lesson, no mission, only the echo of boots on wet pavement and the flicker of neon across rain-slick brick as he was marched out into the alley, sandwich crumbs still clinging to his beard. "Disturbing the peace," the officer muttered into his radio, as if peace could ever be disturbed by a man trying to stay warm. Ray didn't speak. He didn't ask questions. He didn't plead. He simply turned his face slightly away from the patrol car's headlights, letting the cold air dry the shame he refused to show. Behind him, Jimmy cracked open the cafe's back door just an inch, eyes wide with hesitation, then slowly closed it again. At the station, the charges were read like a grocery list. Trespassing, failure to vacate, resisting arrest. The paperwork was fast. The ride to municipal court, silent. By the time Ray was led through the back entrance of the courthouse the next morning, the city had already gone back to forgetting him. The courtroom was sterile and indifferent. Beige walls, fluorescent lights, a bailiff who didn't look up when he called, docket 42A, city versus Callahan. Ray shuffled forward, the cuffs now replaced with a zip tie, ankles swelling against government-issue socks, 2 sizes too tight. The prosecutor, young, polished, well-fed, stood with a confidence that had never been tested in sand or smoke. "Your Honor," he began smoothly, "Mr. Callahan has been warned multiple times by local businesses. This is his 3rd citation this year for loitering near Jefferson Street Cafe. We are recommending 30 days of community service and a no trespass order covering the entire downtown district." Ray kept his eyes low, but something in his posture tensed. That order wouldn't just ban him from the cafe. It would ban him from the shelter on 4th Street, from the soup kitchen at St. Luke's, from the little safe zones he had built over years of silence. And still, he said nothing. The judge looked over her glasses. "Mr. Callahan, do you have representation today?" He shook his head. "Public defender got called to another courtroom. Would you like to make a statement on your own behalf?" A pause. Then, "No excuses, Your Honor. Just trying to stay warm." The silence that followed was heavier than the charges. In the gallery, someone coughed. Another shifted uncomfortably. But no one spoke. No one stood. No one said his name like it mattered. And yet, at the very edge of the courtroom, near the doors, a man in a dark suit entered, calm but quick. He carried a leather briefcase and moved with purpose, pausing only to glance once, directly, at Ray. That glance said more than words. That glance said, "I know who you are." And when the judge returned to the file in front of her, her hand began to tremble. The officer didn't wait for an answer. By the time Ray pushed himself to his feet, stiff joints aching from cold and age, the handcuffs were already out. The metal clicked tight behind his back, and for a moment he winced, but not from pain. From familiarity. It had been decades since he last wore restraint, and back then it was during training exercises. Now there was no lesson, no mission, only the echo of boots on wet pavement and the flicker of neon across rain-slick brick as he was marched out into the alley, sandwich crumbs still clinging to his beard. "Disturbing the peace," the officer muttered into his radio, as if peace could ever be disturbed by a man trying to stay warm. Ray didn't speak. He didn't ask questions. He didn't plead. He simply turned his face slightly away from the patrol car's headlights, letting the cold air dry the shame he refused to show. Behind him, Jimmy cracked open the cafe's back door just an inch, eyes wide with hesitation, then slowly closed it again. At the station, the charges were read like a grocery list. Trespassing, failure to vacate, resisting arrest. The paperwork was fast. The ride to municipal court, silent. By the time Ray was led through the back entrance of the courthouse the next morning, the city had already gone back to forgetting him. The courtroom was sterile and indifferent. Beige walls, fluorescent lights, a bailiff who didn't look up when he called. Docket 42A, City versus Callahan. Ray shuffled forward, the cuffs now replaced with a zip tie, ankles swelling against government-issue socks, 2 sizes too tight. The prosecutor, young, polished, well-fed, stood with a confidence that had never been tested in sand or smoke. "Your Honor," he began smoothly, "Mr. Callahan has been warned multiple times by local businesses. This is his 3rd citation this year for loitering near Jefferson Street Cafe. We are recommending 30 days of community service and a no trespass order covering the entire downtown district." Ray kept his eyes low, but something in his posture tensed. That order wouldn't just ban him from the cafe. It would ban him from the shelter on 4th Street, from the soup kitchen at St. Luke's, from the little safe zones he had built over years of silence. And still, he said nothing. The judge looked over her glasses. "Mr. Callahan, do you have representation today?" He shook his head. "Public defender got called to another courtroom. Would you like to make a statement on your own behalf?" A pause. Then, "No excuses, Your Honor. just trying to stay warm. The silence that followed was heavier than the charges. In the gallery, someone coughed. Another shifted uncomfortably. But no one spoke. No one stood. No one said his name like it mattered. And yet, at the very edge of the courtroom, near the doors, a man in a dark suit entered, calm but quick. He carried a leather briefcase and moved with purpose, pausing only to glance once, directly, at Ray. That glance said more than words. That glance said, "I know who you are." And when the judge returned to the file in front of her, her hand began to tremble. The courtroom hadn't changed, but everything inside it had. After the recess, Judge Parker re-entered, face composed but paler than before. Behind her came 3 uniformed Marines, crisp and silent, their presence slicing through the air like a silent siren. One was a full colonel. Another, a corporal, carried a polished wooden case cradled against his chest as if it were sacred. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. Ray instinctively stood. His joints resisted, but something deeper overrode the pain. Habit. Honor. Reflex. He didn't know why he was rising, only that those uniforms meant something that hadn't touched him in years. The prosecutor's smirk didn't fade. If anything, it sharpened. He straightened his tie and cleared his throat. "Your Honor," he began, "while Mr. Callahan's military service is admirable, it has no bearing on the present charges." Judge Parker raised one hand. He froze. Her voice was low. "Even so?" But it cut the room in half. "Mr. Callahan," she said, "your record indicates service in Fallujah, 2004. 2nd Battalion, 8th Marines, correct?" Ray nodded. Slow. "Yes, ma'am." "And on April 17th, were you involved in an operation on the western outskirts of the city?" His brow furrowed. Something long buried stirred behind his eyes. "We were escorting a convoy. Got hit. Lost a few. Lieutenant Parker was—" He stopped. Judge Parker didn't blink. "You pulled him to cover." The room stopped breathing. Ray's voice dropped. "He told me to leave him. To get the others out. I didn't." "And what happened after?" "Medevac took him. Weeks later I heard he died. I always wondered if I made it worse, getting him out just for him to—" He trailed off. Silence. Then the silver-haired Marine in the gallery rose. His voice cracked the air. "That's him. Staff Sergeant Quinn. I was there. He saved 6 of us that day." The courtroom didn't move. Not a cough. Not a whisper. Even the prosecutor stared now, less certain. Colonel Matthews stepped forward. "By order of the Secretary of the Navy Cross is hereby awarded to Staff Sergeant Mason J. Quinn." The corporal opened the wooden case. Gasps. Dots. Then, stillness again. Rossi didn't speak. He just turned his head, locked eyes with the prosecutor, and raised one brow. That was all. He didn't argue, didn't gloat, just stood beside Ray, the silence louder than any defense. The prosecutor shifted. Once. Then again. The color in his face began to drain. His mouth opened slightly, closed, then opened again. But the words didn't come. Judge Parker leaned back. "This court finds all charges dismissed with prejudice." The gavel struck once. Sharp. Final. Whale. The prosecutor didn't sit, didn't move. He just stood there, blinking. The smile gone. The mask cracked. And for the first time that morning, he looked afraid. Judge Parker sat motionless for a beat that felt like a held breath. Then, with a grace that didn't belong to procedure but to memory, she removed her glasses and folded them with slow precision. For the first time in her career, she didn't speak as a judge. She spoke as a sister. "The Lieutenant Jack Parker mentioned by the defendant was my brother." The words didn't just echo, they landed. Hard. Hard. The gallery gasped. then went dead silent. Even Rossi turned slightly, his posture sharpening. Ray didn't react. Not at first. But his eyes flickered. One blink, then another. As if the name had just now reached its full meaning. She continued, her voice steady but softer now, like a voice from a long hallway. 20 years ago, my brother wrote home about a Marine. A man who ran into fire to drag him out, who refused to leave him behind even when ordered. That man was Sergeant Mason Quinn. This man, standing before us now. A few heads turned toward Ray. Then toward the prosecutor. The shift was slow, deliberate, like a tide pulling back from a shore it no longer respected. The silver-haired Marine stood again, this time with reverence. He got hit twice pulling the lieutenant out, he said. I was there. He saved my life too. The prosecutor opened his mouth, but no words came. His confidence had bled dry. His hands, once poised, now fidgeted at his sides. He glanced around, hoping for something, maybe backup, maybe a reason to keep standing tall. But there was none. Judge Parker nodded toward Colonel Matthews. Staff Sergeant Quinn, the colonel said, stepping forward. Your name was flagged during a Veterans Reconsideration Initiative. Records once sealed have now been reviewed. Intelligence confirms your actions on April 17th did just save your unit. They disrupted a full-scale ambush. He turned to the corporal, who opened the wooden case again, revealing the gleaming Navy Cross. For conspicuous gallantry, the Navy Cross is hereby awarded. The medal caught the light. Cold, unarguable truth cast in silver and blue. Ray didn't move, didn't breathe, just stared. The prosecutor took a step back. You filed charges against a man who was trying to survive winter by sitting near a warm vent, Rossi said, voice like glass cracking in slow motion. You painted him as a nuisance. That was your word. He stepped forward. This, he gestured to the medal. This is what your nuisance looks like. The gallery didn't cheer, didn't move, but something shifted, shoulders straightened, eyes lowered in shame. Even the clerk behind the bench avoided Ray's gaze now. Someone in the back whispered, "We were wrong." A bailiff stepped forward. The prosecutor raised his hands instinctively. "I didn't know." "You didn't ask," Rossi replied. The judge's gavel didn't fall. She didn't need it. She just looked at the prosecutor, long and hard, until he lowered his eyes. "Remove him from the case," she said. Effective immediately. And just like that, the man who had once sneered from behind a polished podium was escorted out, not in cuffs, not in chains, but in silence. And sometimes that's heavier. The door closed behind him, and for the first time all morning, Ray exhaled. Outside the courtroom, the air had shifted. Not cleared, not cleansed, but heavier somehow, like the first hour after a storm. People didn't rush out. They moved slow, uncertain, like stepping into a world they didn't quite recognize. The same world, but not the same people. The bailiff passed Ray without meeting his eye. The clerk gathered her files more quietly than usual. Even the young man in the gallery who had scoffed earlier now sat hunched, elbows on knees, eyes down. When Ray stood to leave, no one blocked his path. No one spoke. But one woman, a waitress from the cafe, stepped aside and whispered, "I'm sorry." She didn't wait for an answer. Just walked away with her head low. Near the courthouse door, Jimmy stood waiting. The cook, who'd once left sandwiches near the vent, now held a paper bag in both hands, stiff with formality. "Hot coffee," he said, avoiding Ray's gaze. "And the other half of that sandwich, this time, you can finish it inside." Ray didn't take the bag right away. He just looked at the man, at the weight in his shoulders, at the apology that didn't need to be said again, and then nodded. A small nod, but it felt like something solid returning to the ground. Colonel Matthews offered a firm handshake before leaving, and Rossi, briefcase in one hand, the other resting on Ray's shoulder, Promised he'd call the VA himself that afternoon. "We'll get it done right," he said. And then they were gone. The city didn't stop. The buses still hissed. The lights still changed. But on that block, something had been rewritten. People paused longer at the crosswalk, held doors a little longer, looked twice before dismissing a man in worn boots. That night, in a small apartment just a few streets over, a unit prepared for veterans who once had no roof, Ray sat at a kitchen table he still wasn't used to. The walls were mostly bare, except for one thing, a frame. Inside it, the Navy Cross, flanked by 2 purple hearts, and below them, a folded American flag. A knock. He opened the door to find Judge Parker, not robed, not guarded, just Olivia now. In her hands, a small wooden box. "I brought something," she said. Inside were letters, dozens of them, faded and worn. "From Jack," she said. "He wrote home every week. This one," she handed him the top envelope, "was the day after you saved him." Ray sat slowly, unfolded the letter like a man handling glass. He read silently at first, then aloud. "He wouldn't leave me, even when I told him to. Said, 'No Marine gets left behind while I'm breathing.'" His voice cracked, just slightly. He folded the letter, hands trembling. "I thought it didn't matter," he said. "All those years on the street. I thought maybe it had all been forgotten." Olivia shook her head. "It wasn't. It isn't." They sat in silence, 2 people bound not by duty or title, but by memory and by what it cost. Outside, the wind moved through the trees like breath. Ray looked around the apartment, the heater humming low, the shadows soft and undisturbed, and said quietly, "This place used to feel like nowhere. Maybe now it can feel like home." The cafe on Jefferson Street used to be just that, a cafe, nothing more. A place of clinking cups, small talk, and cold shoulders. But now, near the kitchen door where steam still curled from the vent Mason once huddled beside, there stood a modest glass case. Inside it, a faded Marine Corps cap, a laminated copy of the Navy Cross citation, and a black and white photo of a younger man, standing in dress blues, unsmiling but steady. Above the display, a small brass plaque simply read, "No Marine left behind." No city official ordered it. No press release announced it. The case had appeared quietly, built by a local carpenter who remembered seeing Mason once salute the flag, even as he was being escorted away in cuffs. Jimmy, the cook, wiped it down every morning. No one asked him to. He just did. Behind the register, a high school girl who'd once mocked the old man's smell now kept a folded napkin in her apron. On it, a quote from the letter Judge Parker had read in court. "Staff Sergeant Quinn wouldn't leave me, even when I ordered him to," he said. "Not on my watch." It was a quote that had started spreading, first in whispers, then in chalk on classroom boards, then printed on the backs of pamphlets handed out by the local veterans group. Not to raise funds, just to remind people. At the local middle school, a history teacher read Jack Parker's letter aloud during Veterans Week. There were no dry eyes. A boy in the front row, usually too restless to stay seated, stood up afterward and asked quietly, "Can I meet him?" He wasn't the only one. Mason didn't attend the dedication, didn't ask for attention. But he did return to the cafe one morning, long after the crowds had gone. He sat at the far corner, back to the wall, where he could see both the door and the small display. Jimmy brought him black coffee without a word. The girl behind the counter nodded at him like she would any regular. He didn't speak. He just sat. Someone else was telling the story now. Weeks later, a local blogger posted a short video, a slow pan across the display case, set to the sound of distant boots and wind. No narration. Just the words on the plaque and a final frame. Mason, sipping coffee in silence, the light catching the edge of his Navy Cross. The clip went viral, not for spectacle but for silence. On the library bulletin board, someone had tacked up a quote. "You don't need to raise your voice when your life has already spoken." No one signed it, and Mason never asked. That winter, the flag outside the cafe never came down. Even through snow, even when the wind snapped it hard against the pole, it stayed up, stitched, weathered, proud. Mason walked past it one morning, collar high, hands deep in his coat. He paused, looked up. Just a moment. No salute, no words, only a nod. And then he kept walking. In the back corner of Rusty Jack's, where the sunlight slanted in just enough to touch the edges of the old wood table, 2 mugs sat between 2 men. One black, still steaming. The other half, full, forgotten. No one else sat nearby. No one else dared to. The quiet wasn't heavy. It was earned. Ray and Daniel Quinn faced each other, not as soldier and son, not as protector and protected, but simply as 2 men who had seen too much and said too little for too long. Daniel didn't speak at first. He watched the steam rise from the mug, watched it swirl and vanish like breath on a cold morning. Ray didn't push. He never had. Then Daniel looked up, the corner of his mouth twitching. Not quite a smile, but close. "You okay, old man?" Ray let out something between a scoff and a breath. "Takes more than a courtroom and a couple of punks to finish me off." The words meant nothing. Meant everything. Daniel reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small object wrapped in cloth. He placed it on the table and slid it forward. Ray unwrapped it slowly, hands weathered, careful. Inside was a compass. Brass. Scratched. Familiar. Taut. Ray's eyes narrowed. Thought this was lost. Daniel shook his head. "Mom kept it. Said one day I'd know when to give it back." They didn't talk about the divorce, or the nights Daniel had yelled, or the mornings Ray had disappeared before sunrise. They didn't need to. Outside, the wind shifted. The flag across the street flapped once, then fell still again. From the bar's old jukebox, a song began to hum. Some forgotten country tune neither of them liked, but both remembered. A track Ray used to play in the garage when tuning up an engine that hadn't run in years. A memory without words. Daniel tapped the table gently, then leaned back. "You did good," he said quietly. "Not just that day. All of them." Ray didn't respond, but he lifted the compass, turned it once in his hand, then slid it into his breast pocket. Not like a symbol, like something that had simply found its way home. The waitress passed by, paused, then left 2 refills without asking. She didn't speak either, but when she walked away, her eyes were red. The light shifted again, growing warmer, dust catching in the beam that fell across Ray's shoulders. Daniel reached over, rested his hand briefly on his father's forearm. Solid. Dight. Present. Fall. They sat like that for a moment longer. Then, without a word, they stood. No hug. No tears. Just 2 men. Tied not by blood alone, but by time, and hurt, and the quiet work of forgiveness. And as they walked out, side by side, the bell above the door rang once. Clear, steady. Behind them, the mugs still steamed. Under the yellowed light of a small-town barbershop, between the soft buzz of clippers and the rustle of newspaper pages, someone said his name. Just Frank. And the room fell quiet for a second, not out of reverence demanded, but respect given. It happened now and then, in churches where pastors used his story to explain what quiet courage looked like, in classrooms where teachers read the letter that once saved a boy's understanding of honor, in libraries where a new shelf bore a small plaque, "Local heroes, their stories matter." The story didn't need exaggeration. It didn't spread through grand speeches or political campaigns. It moved in whispers, nods, reposted articles, and a growing understanding in young people who weren't alive when Frank served, but who now stood taller when a veteran passed. A teenager who used to laugh at the sight of an old man mumbling into a coffee cup now paused to open the door for a stranger in uniform. A group of students raised funds to replace a torn flag outside City Hall because, one of them said, "We can't talk about Frank and still let that happen." Frank never told his story, never sat down for an interview, never corrected the details. He just showed up. At the cafe, the church pew in the back row, the park bench near the war memorial. And somehow, his silence said more than any speech ever could. His son, Daniel, was once reluctant to be part of it. But now, when asked at community events, he read from the same letter Judge Parker had once held in trembling hands. The one Jack wrote. The one that still smelled faintly of dust and desert wind. And each time Daniel read the words, "No Marine gets left behind," someone in the crowd would look down, or wipe a tear, or whisper, "I didn't know." People didn't try to turn Frank into a statue. They knew better. Statues stand still. Frank moved, quietly, daily, through the same streets, nodding to the same faces, his cane tapping steady as a clock. But his story, that didn't stand still. It moved like water, filling cracks, softening edges, reminding people that heroism doesn't need parades to exist. In one elementary school hallway, a photo was hung at eye level for the kids. Frank, uniform, but smiling. Not stern, not posing, just real. Below it, in handwriting copied from a student's notebook, were the words, "Be kind, be quiet, be strong." And on a windy afternoon, weeks later, as the clouds broke and the sun returned, a young boy on his way home stopped in front of that photo. He didn't touch it, didn't say anything, but he stood there for a long time, backpack slipping off one shoulder, hand curled at his side. Then he looked up, beyond the photo, through the hallway window. The flag outside was waving again. And somehow, in that small stillness, you could feel it wasn't just fabric in the wind. It was memory, movement, tight, a life still speaking. The last time Frank stood in Rusty Jack's, no one clapped. No one cheered. The jukebox had gone silent, like even the old songs knew to step aside. He didn't speak, didn't wave. He just stood near the corner booth where it all began. Back straight, eyes calm, breath slow, like the weight on his shoulders had finally been set down without a sound. Around him, people didn't rush. They didn't swarm. They simply rose, one by one, like something invisible had lifted them. Hats came off. Heads bowed. And in that stillness, with dust floating in golden beams of late sunlight, you could hear it. The soft shuffle of boots, the memory of a promise kept. Daniel stood beside his father, not as a protector anymore, but as a son learning how to walk with honor. Frank looked at him then, not with pride, not with pain, just with peace. And in a voice that barely cut through the silence, he said, "You don't have to be loud to be remembered. You just have to stand for something." Outside, the wind tugged gently at the new flag someone had raised. No plaque beneath it. No names etched in stone. Just a clean fold, a steady pole, and a sky wide enough to carry every story, ever whispered too quietly to be heard. If this moment moves something in you, if you believe silence can speak, dignity can endure, and no life lived in service should ever fade into forgetfulness, then type honor below, not for applause, but as a promise. And if you want more stories like this, stories that echo long after the last line, then join us. Not just as a viewer, but as someone who still believes in the quiet strength of a good man.